Hey guys, welcome back once again to Meghan Grace DIY. Today's tutorial is going to show you how to make a shaped face mask, but I'm going to add in a little bit of a fashion flair. Over the past few weeks, most of us that can sew have been dedicating our time to making face masks for those who are on the front lines. But then once the CDC announced that everyone should be wearing a face mask, things started to sort of shift. Even though right now we think of face masks as protective gear and something that's necessary to be worn outside, face masks have actually been worn by different cultures for a variety of reasons. If you take a look at some of the masks worn at places like Coachella or Burning Man or other types of music festivals, they really become works of art on top of the fact that they serve a function. And given the fact that I'm a costume designer and a fashion designer myself, I decided to use today's tutorial to not only show you how to make a functional shaped face mask, but also add my own artistic spin to it. For today's project, you're going to need 15 inches by 7 inches of 100% cotton for the outer layer, 15 inches by 7 inches of interfacing, 12 inches by 9 inches of lining fabric, about 20 inches if you want to create a binding. You're going to need 2 pieces of 7-inch long elastic, 1 pipe cleaner, and some rhinestones and glue. I started out by making a couple of different patterns, and I really liked the way that this one that I had on my face looks, but one of the big problems was the liner would kind of bunch up on the inside, and I would inhale it sometimes, and it was a little bit too short to go underneath my chin. The overall mask comfort is something that's really important to me because I'm sure, like many people, if you feel like you can't breathe in the mask, you're going to get anxious and you're not going to want to wear it. I had a nice friend donate this fabric to me, so one of the design aspects I was going for was having the skull on each side of the mask. The fabric was totally a score from Walmart, and it matches my nails, which makes it even better. Given that I'm trying to get a skull on each side of the mask, we're going to have to fiddle with our pattern placement a little bit. If I was making masks for frontline workers, I really wouldn't worry about where the skull was placed because it does kind of create some fabric waste, and in times like these, I really don't like to waste fabric. So once I've chosen a skull that I think the pattern will fit on top of, I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to lay my pattern. My fabric is not folded in half right now. I'm double checking for 2 things. One, that the skull will not be too close to the center seam, and the second, that the dart that's on the side of the mask won't run into the skull, thus kind of warping the design. I'm going to go ahead and pin the pattern piece in place and cut that sucker out. While I'm doing that, I figured I'd share just a little bit about myself since I don't really talk about myself much in my tutorials. But one thing I wanted to show you guys was I really love the sugar skull motif. I think it's really beautiful, and I think the history behind it is really beautiful. So 2 years ago, I actually did a really cool sugar skull costume design, and I'm going to show you guys some pictures of that. So I by no means consider myself a makeup artist. Everything I did for our makeup, I actually learned it on YouTube. I primarily used Ben Nye makeup, and I used eyelash glue to glue down all the rhinestones, and I think my boyfriend gets some very special props for sitting for 2 hours while I did his makeup. And this is the kind of witch doctor light up hat, and it's like the coolest hat I've ever made. And lastly, here's our look all done, all together. We had an absolutely awesome time that night and got a lot of really nice compliments on our costume. And look at that! Our pattern piece is all cut out. The really great part about this fabric is when you flip it, you can see the skull. So it's going to make lining it up with another skull a lot easier. So I've picked a skull that I'm going to go ahead and line up with, placing the pattern piece, making sure that they're lined up perfectly, and then I can go ahead and pin it and cut it out. With our outside layer all cut out, you can see that the skulls are mirror images. Next, I'm going to go ahead and cut an outside layer out of interfacing. I've seen some people use this step and some people not. It's really up to you whether you want to give your mask a little bit more body. As you can see with my interfacing, it's a woven interfacing. With my interfacing folded in half, I'm going to take the outside mask pattern piece, pin it to the interfacing, and cut out 2 pieces. And there we go, all cut out. Next, I'm going to take my lining fabric and I'm going to go ahead and fold it in half. You're going to take the inside mask pattern piece and follow the steps we've done before. Pin it down and cut it out. You should have 2 sides to the inside of the mask. It's also important to note that I'm not cutting out any of the darts. I'm just cutting past them. Next, we take the outside of the mask along with our interfacing pieces over to the iron. I'm using an iron-on interfacing, so you want to make sure that the bumpy side of that interfacing is touching the fabric. If the bumpy side is up, it's going to get stuck to your iron, and it's going to cause you a bunch of problems that you really don't want. When pressing down interfacing, you can either use a damp towel or you can spritz a little water on it, just like I did with my iron here, before actually doing the pressing. You're going to press nice and slow and make sure you get all areas of the interfacing. So when I pick the pattern piece up, it's going to still have some nice movement to it, but it'll feel a little bit stiffer, but you shouldn't see the interfacing peeling off any of the edges. If it is, go back and repress it. Next, I'm going to show you how I mark my darts. There's many different ways to mark your darts. This is just a really quick and dirty way, and if this isn't the way you do it, then please keep doing it the way that you do it yourself. What I've done here is I've marked the base of each of the dart legs with a pin and the tip of the dart with a pin. And now I'm going ahead and I'm marking those with a piece of tailor chalk. Some people are totally fine with just those markings. Some people want to draw the actual dart in. Another way to do this is to use tracing paper and a tracing wheel, and you can trace the dart that way. But you can see me here just kind of drawing lightly the dart in, so I'll know where to sew on the machine. Then, because I have the other side of the mask, I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to push the pins through at the dart point and the end of the dart legs, and I'm going to flip it over and use that to mark with my tailor chalk. Now that our darts are marked, I've gone ahead and I've pinned the wrong sides of the fabric together for the outside of the mask. Sewing on a curve can always be a little bit tricky. This is a pretty shallow curve, so it shouldn't be too bad. And you're going to sew with a straight stitch and at 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. Go ahead and repeat the same step for the lining of the mask. So this is what your mask should look like so far, from the inside and from the outside. Next, we're going to move on to the darts, which you can see I've marked here on the sides of the mask. I'm going to fold in half, matching where the 2 dart legs should go, and I'm going to pinch it towards the point of the dart. I'm going to go ahead and put a pin horizontally in place to hold the dart closed. You're going to start at the top of the dart legs and stitch towards the point of the dart. When you pull the dart off of the machine, you want to make sure you leave your threads hanging. You're going to then take those threads and you're going to tie them in a knot. This will ensure that the tip of your dart will not unravel. Now let's take a look at that curve that we just sewed. Anytime you sew a curve in sewing, it's also referred to as a princess seam. And we have to take out little pie slices from the seam allowance so that curve will lay flat. Since the seam here is so small, I'm using my nail scissors to clip those little pie slices out of the seam, but usually regular scissors will do. We do this because when we go ahead and flip the seam the other way or facing outwards, the seam allowance on the inside won't get bunched up because we've relieved some of that bulk. And we're going to go ahead and keep doing our pie slices until the entire seam has pie slices in it. And I did the same exact thing to our lining. Now we're ready to press both the outside and inside layers. Anytime you're pressing darts, if it's a horizontal dart, you press downwards. So we're going to go ahead, we're going to take those darts and we're going to press them down towards our waist. If you have vertical darts, you press them inwards towards the center of the body. So in a perfect world, anytime you're pressing something that's curved, like a princess seam, a bust seam, or this mask, you would use something called a tailor ham. A tailor ham is this stiff, round pillow that we use to press curves. Chances are most of you don't have a tailor ham at home. I think I have one somewhere, but not really sure where it is. So what we're gonna do is make the best of it. I'm just gonna go ahead and press that curve from the inside. Now we're gonna go ahead and repeat all the same steps by pressing the darts and pressing the curve on our lining. But on our lining, we're gonna go ahead and take the edge We're gonna fold it over 3/8 of an inch, and we're gonna go ahead and press that down. And then I'm gonna take that over to the machine and I'm gonna stitch it down. I'm gonna repeat for the other side. Now we're ready to join up the lining of the mask with the outside of the mask. Take those center seams and line them up, and the rough edge of the seams, they should be touching each other so they end up inside of the mask, not touching your face. Go ahead and pin both edges together, and don't worry that right now that lining is significantly shorter than the outside of the mask. You're gonna see why it's like that in a minute. What's eventually gonna happen is that extra fabric is going to be rolled inward, and that'll be the casing where our elastic goes. I'm gonna go ahead, take my mask to the machine, and I'm gonna baste the lining in place, right along where I'm pointing out. A basting stitch is when you have your stitch length turned all the way up to 5. It's not really meant to hold anything in place, it's just a temporary stitch. And since we're gonna sew over this area again, it's okay that we use a basting stitch here. So if you can't already tell, I really like the colors black and aqua together. So I decided to take a little bit of aqua fabric and I'm gonna use it to bind the top and the bottom of the mask to give it a little bit of an extra flair. I'm taking the strip of fabric that I cut and I'm lining it up with the top line of the mask. The strip that I cut is about 1.5 inches wide, but this would also work with bias tape if you have any on hand. I'm gonna go ahead and stitch that piece to the top of the mask at about 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. I'm making sure right now that the right side edge of that fabric trim I'm adding is even with the right side edge of my mask. And now I'm gonna go ahead and repeat with the bottom part of the mask. To be able to shape my nose, I took a pipe cleaner and I folded it in half. I'm pinning it at the center front on the top, and then I'm gonna go ahead, I'm gonna zigzag it along the seam. The pipe cleaner is gonna end up being covered by the binding, so you don't have to worry about it touching your skin. Once our nose piece is sewn in, we're gonna go back to the ironing board, and we're gonna go ahead and take that trim and we're gonna press it down nice and flat. Make sure you press both sides. Then we're gonna flip it over and we're gonna go ahead and press that trim towards the inside of the mask. But what we wanna do first is just check and see how there's like a little bump there. We wanna go ahead and trim that down because any of those little bumps, you'll be able to see those in the edging, and we want that edging to be really nice and smooth. With all of those bumps cleared, we can go ahead and press that trimming towards the inside of the mask. And then once we've pressed it towards the inside, we're gonna roll it up underneath about 1/2 inch and press that down flat as well. See here, I'm gonna take that rough edge, I'm gonna tuck it underneath, and then I'm gonna press that flat. So that way the binding will be really nice and finished on the inside. I always learned in fashion school that you want the inside of your garment or project to look just as good as the outside does. Once the binding is pressed and ready to go, we're going to sew it in place with something called a slip stitch. I also refer to this as the tunnel and bite technique. This basically means that you take your needle and you slide it along the tunnel or the fold of the fabric, and then you take a small bite out of the lining of the mask. I'm gonna repeat this a couple times so you can kind of see the idea, but I also have another video on my channel that shows you exactly how to do a slip stitch if you've never done a slip stitch before. A whip stitch would also work very well in this situation. We're gonna go ahead and continue doing that slip stitch all the way down the edging of the binding. And we're gonna repeat this on the top edge of the binding as well until the binding is completely sewn in place. And there you go. Now we have a beautiful touch of color at the top and the bottom of the mask. Now looking from the inside of the mask, I'm gonna go ahead and apply a small zigzag stitch to both edges before I go ahead and roll them to make the casing. I'm gonna go ahead and take the edge of the mask, I'm gonna fold it over 3/8 of an inch, and I'm gonna press that flat. Then I'm gonna fold it another 1/2 of an inch and press that flat as well. We should be meeting up now with the edge of the lining. And now you can go ahead and flip and do the other side. Now you're going to take your casing and you're going to stitch it down with a straight stitch, stitching close to the left side of the fold. You want to make sure you're leaving enough room to string your elastic through. You're going to go ahead and do this to both sides. And hopefully by now you can see that that little tiny gap between the lining and the casing is where you can insert a filter if you'd like to. So now that we've got our casing completed, we're going to go ahead and insert our elastic using a safety pin. I'm using about a 7-inch piece of elastic that's 1/4 of an inch wide. You take your safety pin and you slide it through the casing and use that to pull your elastic through. And I'm just going to point out one more time, as you're pushing that through, you can see how that lining kind of pops up a little bit and reveals a hole. That's where you would slide your filter in. Once you've got the elastic pulled through the casing, you're going to want to go ahead and sew it together. You can do this on the machine, but I like to do it by hand and lay the elastic one on top of the other, so that way it's nice and flat. You don't have any bumps when you push it back through into the casing. We're pushing it back into the casing, so that way, it just looks a lot nicer and more professional. So at this point, your shape mask is basically done. But just you wait. We've got one more thing to do to really knock this thing out of the park. So one more thing a lot of people don't know about me is that for 18 years, I was a competitive figure skater. I am absolutely in love with rhinestones, and I used to make all my own skating costumes. So if I can put rhinestones on it, you better believe I'm putting rhinestones on it. So for the final step here, I'm breaking out my Aleene's Jewelette and some crystals, and I'm gonna add some crystals to the face of the skulls. Swarovski crystals have often been the leader in crystals for a really long time, but I've gotten some crystals on Amazon lately for a pretty good price, like these that you see here, that have some really, really beautiful sparkle to them. There's definitely some tools out there to help apply rhinestones, but I go the old-fashioned way by just putting a little bit of glue onto a tip of a pencil and letting it dry so it's kind of tacky and I can pick the rhinestones up that way. I'm only going to share a little portion of the crystalling process, but I kind of just freehand it and decide where I think crystals would look best. I take a little tiny bit of glue, less is always more when it comes to glue, and then place the crystals that I feel like would look best in those spots, and just really kind of let the creativity flow. So here I'm placing just a few more red crystals on the red part of the skull, and those are very small. They're about a size 10 SS. And just like that, I think my skull is fully crystallized. And what would a rhinestone project be without a little touch of a Facebook filter to make those sparkles pop even more? So we can see here the final product on my face. It's a little bit longer than that first mask I showed you. I'm gonna go ahead, I'm gonna pinch in the nose using the pipe cleaner to make sure that fits properly. So I like how this shape is a little bit bigger in the chin, so that gives me room to talk and not have the mask fall down, and it fits all the way up to my ears, and I think just is a really nice shape for my face. So even though we all have to wear masks right now to protect ourselves as well as others, we can still express a little bit of our own personal style. So before we end today's tutorial, I just want to make a few notes. If you don't have a large printed pattern and aren't looking to necessarily put like those skulls on each side or some kind of image on each side, you don't have to cut the pattern out the way that I did. I do find that way a bit wasteful for fabric, but for just one mask, I really did want to have a nice artistic flair. I also want to note that the patterns I used today are available in the description below, as well as the pattern for the slightly tighter and smaller mask that I show at the beginning of the tutorial. And I also really want to thank everyone that has subscribed so far and supported me in this endeavor. I reached 250 subscribers today, which is a huge milestone. And most of all, I want to thank our nurses and our frontline workers. You guys are the real heroes in all of this, putting your life on the line every single day. I hope you enjoyed some of the cool tips and tricks that I shared in this tutorial. And as always, happy sewing!